right, with us on the line now is Jean Jeanenney. Welcome to the show, John.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I gotta tell you, when I originally had the idea to talk about this topic of tracking and blood trailing and recovering deer, I asked a handful of people that I really respect, and everybody pointed me to you as the person that I needed to talk to. So both I and Dan, and I think all of our listeners, are excited to hear some of your expertise and your experiences when it comes to recovering deer. And I suppose before we get into all of that, could you just share with us a little bit of your background, how you came to have so much experience when it comes to this type of thing?
Well, it really starts when I wounded a deer myself. And I was very upset about it. Twig hit my shotgun slug, and I spent a whole day looking. There was no blood, and a week later, some other hunters found the deer in a swale 300 yards away. And at this time, I realized that if I had had a good tracking dog of the type that they use in Europe, this wouldn't have happened. And I had learned about tracking dogs in Europe. I was doing some research at the French National Forestry School, and I made a number of German friends there. They were German exchange students, and they introduced me to tracking dogs in Germany and wire-haired dachshunds. Already, I came home from that research year with my first dachshund. And, of course, the problem at that time was that using a dog in any form in deer hunting was illegal. And that was not just my state of New York State, but pretty much over the whole Northeast and Midwest. The South was different. We don't have to get into that now. So I applied to our conservation department for a research permit to see if this would work over here. After a lot of talking, I got that permit and began to take calls for hunters who couldn't find their deer. And my luck was I had an amazingly good dog, and we were very successful. So that's the way it got started. And so the research permit was expanded to other people who were interested in tracking dogs. And then finally, the whole procedure was legalized in 1988. It had started in 1976. So this is a long way off, a long way back. But anyway, for the next 40 years, I'm 81 now, I was tracking with some very smart dogs who taught me a lot, because a dog doesn't, a so-called blood tracking dog doesn't need blood to track. They follow the individual scent of the deer. We can go into that later if it's necessary. And it was possible to see what wounded deer do when they're hit and when they go farther than hunters ordinarily able to track. And I ended up taking over, well, actually exactly 1,108 calls. And my dogs taught me a lot. I really owe it to the dog. I ended up, with a pretty good idea of how to evaluate a hit. I wrote a book on that. And how to track them when there's no blood to track with. And I wrote a book on that, tracking dogs for finding wounded deer. And I've had a wonderful time with this. I think it's important for ethical and conservation reasons, but tracking with a dog, working in partnership with a dog on a difficult task, is an extraordinary experience in itself. It helps you to be a little bit of a dog yourself. And this has been my passion.
Now, like you mentioned a second ago, so you've written a book on how to use dogs to help find deer, and then also what you've learned from your dogs, that you've now applied in another book about just generally how to go
Yeah.
about this whole process of
That
finding.
one was called Dead On.
Yeah, dead on. So kind of what I wanted to do here was kind of frame our conversation around both of those two topics. Maybe start with some of the things that we can do without a dog, and then eventually we can also talk about what you could do if, or how to find someone who has a dog, or what to do if you had a dog, or all those different things. So maybe can we start from the beginning, John? Let's say
Sure.
I'm a hunter and I've just shot a deer. Let's say I'm bow hunting. I've just shot a deer. What are some of the things that we as a hunter should be thinking about immediately at that point? As soon as that arrow hits the deer, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about to help make sure we can get that proper recovery?
Okay, first I think you should try to get as good a memory of the hit site where the arrow entered the deer, if that's possible. Then you have to decide what your tactics are going to be for finding that deer. The deer may go 50 yards and collapse, and that's the most likely scenario, and that's great. But if you don't actually see the deer go down, I think it's a good idea to get down fairly quickly and go to the hit site and evaluate it. And depending on what you see, you can decide how to handle the situation. I think too many of the writers in the past have tried to deal with wounded deer all in one category. Oh, you always wait. You wait 8 hours, you do whatever. And I think that this is oversimplifying the thing. You go to the hit site. Of course, it's great if you can recover your arrow, and you smell it. A lot of hunters don't do that. But if you smell that arrow, if it's gone a little bit far back into the paunch, you're going to smell kind of a cow barn smell. If it's going back a little bit farther, it's going to be deer dropping smell. And if that's the case, you've got the gut shot, and you don't want to get started on this right away. I think the ideal point there is to back out and wait, if the coyotes will let you do it, for 8 hours, and then go in and track. And by that time, the deer should be dead or very much weakened. But on the other hand, suppose you see bone fragments. Almost always those are from the legs. Now, in cases like that, the old saying, "Oh, always wait," is all wrong, because in a case like this, the deer is going to bleed out through the broken bones. But you've got to push the deer to keep it the blood flowing. If you let the deer bed down and relax, the blood will stop, coagulate much sooner. So you've got to make that evaluation. You look for evidence of a chest shot. That's what you want. But my dogs have taught me that a one-lunger is not always fatal. I've learned by talking to medical people that when a lung collapses, the flow of blood to that lung cuts way down, and the deer or the wounded soldier can survive on the other lung. And then very often that lung actually comes back into function later on. So here, it's kind of tricky. I think the best situation would be wait 2 hours and then push the deer. We can learn a lot from Army medics. When a soldier is wounded, they try to keep him quiet and keep the blood flow down. They don't let him exercise. So, you have to make all these distinctions, and you make those by evaluating the hit site. And, of course, evaluating the type of hair that you've got is a very important part of this. Now, this is complicated. I don't deal with it in my book because in different parts of the United States, the hair color and composition is quite different. It depends on the season, too. But evaluating the hair is very important. And you do all these things, and then you decide what your tactic is going to be for finding that deer. Something new that's come in since I started tracking in the Northeast. The coyotes invaded, and now if you leave an animal out overnight, where I track, you've got a 30% chance of having it devoured by coyotes. So you've got to balance this into your plan of how to track that deer. It's more complicated than it used to be.
Yeah. So step one, we've checked out the site, we've analyzed the arrow, we've smelled it, we've looked to see if there's hair, maybe we've checked to see the color of the blood, some things like that to try to figure out, okay, where did I hit this deer if I don't know for sure. So you said if it's a gut shot or a paunch shot, wait at least 8 hours. What about a liver shot?
Well, usually that goes with a paunch shot because the liver lies alongside the stomach. But a liver shot is invariably fatal. A wound to the liver doesn't seem to clot up. It continues oozing. Now, you can read books that say that a liver shot deer will never go more than 400 yards, whatever. Well, I've found them going unpushed over a mile and climbing a hill to bed down and die. But they're going to die. And, I think on these cases it's better to wait and let that loss of blood, that oozing loss of blood, become fatal. If you push it, the deer's still going to die. But if you push it and it stops bleeding, you're in trouble.
Yeah. So that's one of the situations then, along with gut shots, that you recommend not pushing it. But it sounds like
usually a gut shot and a liver shot are combined.
Okay.
Because the liver lies right alongside the main paunch, main stomach.
Yeah. But then for a chest shot, so lungs, heart, you're saying get right after them, which, like you said, is a little bit different than what we hear from a lot of people. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you have to move. When you begin tracking, you track with great caution. And it's nice to have a hunting buddy. One person eye tracks, and the other keeps his eyes out ahead to see if you can get another shot. But a deer is more likely to weaken if he's shot in the lungs than if he's pushed. Now, there are always other things that come into this. You got property lines and so forth. And I don't want to confuse people here. I'm just saying you got to think out every individual situation, not just go with the old boys' advice, wait until morning.
What about body shots? Like if I just get a brisket shot in front of the shoulder, or I hit in the back leg. I mean, one of these worst case scenarios where it's a shot that you typically don't think would be fatal. Do you push right after that with the hope of maybe I can keep this deer bleeding? Or what do you do in that?
Yeah, with these body shots, there are times when you can get the deer. There's a big femoral artery that goes down along behind the bone in the hind quarter. You nick that, you're going to get that deer. But it's impossible to tell immediately whether you're just in flesh or you're in that major artery. Same thing with neck shots. I don't like them at all. But if you nick the jugular vein or the carotid artery, that deer is going to die. So you always try. I would never advocate saying, well, there's no point in tracking this deer, because there is so many unknowns and uncertainties when you evaluate a hit site.
Yeah.
How do you know when to do that? I mean, I'll give a couple examples. And one was a couple years ago. I shot a doe, and my immediate reaction was dead deer. This doe is toast. Tons of good blood for 100 yards, and I waited probably 30 minutes because I felt that this doe is going to die. And that 100 yards, right towards the end of it, it started it shut off. And then I went maybe 50, 60 more yards, and I found just a little drop. And then that was it. I had gone 200 yards, then I started gritting. What's something that I may have done wrong, or if you were by my side, what would you have told me to do?
No, I think this is a pretty good tactic that you did. You probably had, just a flesh wound that would bleed heavily and then clot up. But the next step, when you run out of blood, if you can call a tracker with a trained leash tracking dog, he's going to be able to take that deer a lot farther. And, you may have a pretty good idea of where in the muscle you hit the deer. For instance, on a high neck shot or a high shoulder shot, we never get those. But, the tracker can help hunter evaluate the situation if the hunter gives him the detail.
Okay.
But I think what you did was fine. If there had been a tracker available and you figured you had a pretty good hit, you could go farther. But a deer will bleed very heavily from a flesh wound, but seldom enough to kill them.
What about that kind of the no man's land shot that some people talk about? This area that's debated, just underneath the spine. Some people say that if you hit underneath the spine, there's this area where there's not a lethal hit. It gets above the lungs and all that. What have you seen from that type of situation? Are those deer recoverable, or is that not going to die?
They're very tough. Those shots are very tough to evaluate. Generally, if the arrow enters the deer less than 6 inches from the top line as you see it, which includes hair, the chances are poor. But there are exceptions to everything. There's a big artery, the dorsal aorta, that runs along right under the spine. And if you clip that deer is going to be down in 100 yards. And there's no way that you can tell. And also with those dorsal aorta shots, there's going to be very little bleeding on the outside. The blood is just going to cascade into the chest cavity.
It's a tough one.
With calls like that, if the arrow is definitely down, 6 inches or more, we take the call. But we know that the chances of getting the deer are not great. Generally, we found that if you track a deer a half mile and on a chest shot, if it's a chest shot, a high chest shot or whatever, if he goes a half mile, he's probably going to survive because he's got a wound that's going to coagulate and clot up, and the blood will stop. But there's no way of knowing. One of the great uses of a tracking dog is to determine whether the deer is mortally wounded or not. They make a big thing of this in Europe. They call it a control search. But there's no way that you can be sure at the hit site of what you got. And, I've tracked a lot of these deer, and the hunter is really grateful when I can show him that the deer is going to be okay. He just doesn't want that deer to rot in the woods, and I sure respect that.
Yeah. What were you saying, Dan?
Well, I was going to kind of go a little bit of a different direction. I mean, after these deer, and maybe by all these track jobs that you've been on, whether the hunter has a dog or doesn't have a dog, do deer tend to do the same thing every time after they're wounded? You hear people talk about water. You hear people talk about going downhill, or they'll never jump a fence, or things like that. Are there any trends that you've noticed that you can share with us that might help?
I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah. No, I don't think that there are trends. When a deer is wounded, he goes back. He tries to get back to a place that's safe and secure, his bedding area. Now, during the rut, a buck may be quite a ways away from that. but they'll go for that, and they'll go uphill or downhill. They go where they want to go. A lot of times I've come in and the hunter said, we've looked everywhere. We can't find this deer. We've grid searched the whole thing. What about that ridge over there? Well, wounded deer won't climb a steep slope. Yeah, but the dogs say he did climb it, and there's the deer at the top dead. So, the deer does what is secure safety place for him. And the only generalization I think that holds pretty true is if a deer is shot in the intestines or the stomach, gut shot, they will get thirsty. They'll dehydrate after a while. And if there's water available, they'll go to that. And they wait out in it. A lot of times we find them dead in the water. That's kind of predictable. But other things, no. I'm just amazed at what deer will do. Does usually won't go as far. They're closer to their bedding area than a buck during the rut. But, if you get caught up in these generalizations, the deer is going to always go downhill. And I've read this in a lot of books. They will go downhill if that's where they want to go. But a deer goes where he wants to go until he runs out of gas, runs out of blood. And that could be in various places.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear that, because I think so many of us have been almost trained to just assume some of these generalizations are true. I think it's been ingrained in so many of us over time. But it's interesting. I mean, I think your sample size that you've been able to look at, well over 1,000, animals you've tracked. I think it's pretty clear that if you're not seeing that as a consistent trend, well, it's going to be a lot bigger than any of our sample size that we can personally.
You got to keep your mind open.
Yeah, for sure. I've got a question that's popped up that kind of goes back to something we talked about a little while ago when we were talking about determining how long to wait. And I know you said to wait, a pretty decent amount of time, 8 hours or more for a paunch, a liver, intestine, et cetera, et cetera. But how does rain factor into that determination? Are you going to change things up if there's rain in the forecast or rain happening right now?
That's a good question. Rain will dilute the blood so that there's nothing that the hunter can see. But the scent is still there. And dogs also, they track other scents that come from the deer, particularly the interdigital scent. There's an interdigital gland between the cloves of the hoof, kind of high on that slot there. And that is an individual scent, and a dog, when he's trained, will follow that very well. So rain doesn't bother an experienced tracker at all, unless, if it's 3-4 inches, okay, that's one thing. But, the normal thing, a half inch, 1 inch, no, the dog can track just the same. Matter of fact, that's better than dry, windy conditions. Early in bow season, it allows dry leaves blowing around on the ground, and the humidity is low. That's a lot tougher than the situation after most rainfalls.
So, what if you don't have access to a dog? Would you say that you I mean, this is the thing I always deal with myself, is do I head right in because I want to try to take advantage of whatever small amount of blood is available, or do you wait a longer period of time because your hope is that I'm not going to have a blood trail of any sort, but hopefully he dies or she dies close enough that when I do kind of a body search, I'll be able to find it. Sounds like a dog is the best case or the best option, but what if I can't get a hold of a dog? What would you do then?
Well, then, when you get to the point beyond fairly easy tracking, quit and wait. Because what you don't want to do in a situation like this is jump the deer out of his bed, when he's still alive and he takes off without blood. That deer is gone. Now, if you got a tracking dog, that's not a problem because he's going to follow that deer out of his bed. But generally, wait. I'm not against grid searches within in reason. Usually, this disrupts scent, but not to an extreme degree. And there you got a chance of finding a deer like that. It depends if you're hunting in brushy fields. You got to work pretty closely, make a pretty close grid. If you're out in open hardwoods, roam around and look in the general area. You can spot a deer down, spot his white belly, 100 yards away.
Yeah.
But
So,
I think in cases that don't involve broken legs, you're better off waiting once you're sure that the deer hasn't gone down, in the area that there was easy tracking. With leg hits, the blood comes out through the marrow bone. And if you keep pressure on the deer, he will bleed so that you can eye track him and find him. I've tracked deer like this 4 miles. No, that's unusual. But you can usually spot a leg hit deer by bone fragments and also by, smears on logs and so forth where the deer has dragged his leg across the log.
yeah, interesting. So you mentioned this question of, or you mentioned grid searching, and Dan mentioned it too. And this is another one of the things I've thought about, because I've got a friend who has a tracking dog that I've thought about, and I usually will take her along on track jobs, even when I know it's going to be an easy job, just because we want to give her experience. But I think one of the questions is, lots of times if someone knows that they can get a hold of a tracking dog or something, there's this question of, when do I stop trying to find it myself and get a hold of this person with a dog? Like, at what point am I screwing things up more than I'm helping them by trying to find it myself? Because I know, for me at least, I think a lot of us in this situation, we just want to find our deer now, and we just want it to happen. And so there's this allure of, well, let me just try a little further, let me just look over this hill, or let me just circle this area. But some guys say, well, you do that, you're screwing up your chances of the dog being able to actually find it in the future. So what do you say to that, John? When is it better for me just to stop and pull out and get a hold of that dog?
Well, I would say if you're blood tracking by eye and the deer is not laying down, there's no evidence that the deer is about ready to drop, back out when eye tracking becomes difficult or impossible. Now that's not the European theory, but in America you try to do things yourself if you can. It depends so much on the circumstances. If you're in an area where you think you could do a fairly effective grid search over maybe a 200-yard area, you might grid search that. But we do find as trackers that when we go into an area that's been grid searched where the deer scent has been tracked up by the hunter, it makes things more difficult. Usually I find I can surmount the difficulties, but that's not the ideal. But as long as you can eye track, there's no need for a dog. This whole business of calling the leash tracking dog a blood tracking dog is a mistake. I use the term myself, but they're useful. They become useful when there's no blood to track.
How does that process usually work? Are there, I know that tracking dogs and their handlers are kind of becoming much more popular across the country as more and more states legalize it. But I understand there's some different tracking associations and groups like that across the country that help set up hunters with a dog. Is that something? Is that true? Is there some different people or organizations we can get in touch with to find the right people to help?
Yeah, I'm a founder of 2 organizations, Deer Search Incorporated in New York State, and then United Blood Trackers. We have co-founders. We don't provide people with dogs, but we give them assistance in training, and we also publicize the services that they make available. For instance, in United Blood Trackers, You can go to their website and click on Find a Tracker, and then you'll see the states, 35 states in which tracking is legal. You click on the state, and you can get a listing of the trackers in that state and where they're located, in terms of a town. So that's, they play an important role that way. Deer Search in New York State actually does dispatching too. When a hunter calls in and says, I got a deer I can't find, I've tried everything, they'll put him in touch with a tracking dog in the area where he was hunting. So they play that role, but they don't get involved in providing the dogs, and you buy your dogs kind of on the open market. And then also these organizations promote the idea of tracking in states where it still sounds like a crazy idea. They tell interested leaders, well, this is what our experience has been in New York State or Vermont, and we give them some of the correspondence, the text of the bills that have been passed, so they have an idea of where they're going.
Speaking of bills and laws related to this, what kind of laws are typically around the use of tracking dogs? I think it's not free for all, right? You can't just go out there with a dog and go chase after these deer, right? There are some limitations and restrictions in most states.
Oh yeah. In all but the Deep South and in Texas, number one, the dog has to be kept on a leash from 30 to 50 feet. In some states, you can carry a firearm to put down the deer if it's still alive. In other states, that's not permitted. Most states allow tracking day or night, but some restrict it to the daytime. It's a very complicated thing, There's a set of 35 different regulations. But I think the important thing to realize is that in the Northeast and the mid to west, extending pretty far south, the use of dogs in deer hunting was outlawed for good reasons. It was, it was almost exterminating deer. And now the use of tracking dogs is presented by legislation as an exception. And the most important thing here is the dog is kept at all times on a tracking leash.
Okay. Now, what about if, I've thought about this too, what if you wanted to try to get your own tracking dog? Is there any specific type of dog that's best, or specific things you should look for in a dog if you were trying to train your own?
Oh boy, that is a question. There are specialized breeds that are used for tracking, and you can buy them in Europe or from certain breeders in the United States. For instance, there's the Bavarian Mountain Bloodhound from Germany, the Hanoverian Bloodhound. What has become very popular is a breed that I started with, the European wire-haired Dachshund, which is quite different from the American Dachshund. They're registered by AKC, but they're higher in the legs, shorter in the back. I have a wiry coat, and they're much more agile, and they have much more endurance. The right kind of lab is very good. Not the pet lab, the show lab, or the kind of hyper lab that's used in competition, retrieving competitions. But I've seen some marvelous labs. And then a breed from Texas is becoming more and more popular now is the Blue Lacy. So there is quite a number, but and you can't always go by breed labels. I mean, there are duds in all these breed categories, and there are some very good dogs that don't come out of one of these breeds. But usually your odds of getting a talented dog are better if you stick with a breed that's got the right temperament and the right habits for using its nose. A lot of it goes into training too. There's an opportunity to buy good prospects in the United States. The demand now is very strong. The demand for tracking dogs is expanding faster than the supply. And I think this is going to settle out. The wire dachshund breed he's handy because he's a small dog that you can easily to transport. He's a good small companion in the house, and he can be very, very talented. But he's certainly not the only breed that can do this. I would say wire dachshund does not have a bloodhound caliber nose. By the way, there are some American bloodhounds working too, but that's a lot of dog. But usually even a dachshund is going to be able to track wounded deer with no visible blood anyway for up to 24 hours. And in most of our hunting in the Northeast and the Midwest, this is long enough. Now you get trophy hunters that, they want that rack. I shot the deer last week, but I don't care about the meat. I just want that gorgeous set of antlers. There you want American bloodhound or the Bavarian mountain bloodhound or the Hanoverian bloodhound. There's no one perfect breed. I think you've got to find what suits you best.
So what about, the old adage, you can't teach an old dog new tricks? Is that true? Is this the kind of situation where you need to get a puppy to train him or her to do this kind of thing? Or can I take maybe I've had a lab my whole life and he's 6 or 7 years old and I want to train him to do this now. Is that possible?
Sure. I think it depends on whether the lab has been hunted, has learned to use his nose and, to relate to his handler. I've had the best dog I ever had was Clary, and she didn't start until she was 4. But, I'd hunted other things with her, raccoons, pheasants, and so forth. But to just take a dog that's been a house dog and ask them at 5 or 6 to track, to learn to stay on the right line, all that, that's reaching out pretty far. I think when you get into 8 or 9 years old, by the time the dog has learned from practical experience, as well as training what to do, the dog is going to begin to fail because of age. So, I think the ideal thing for most people is to get a good puppy from a breeder who is into blood tracking and has good blood tracking dogs. But you can develop other dogs to do this. With the pointing breeds, some of them are marvelous. I've seen marvelous German wire dachshunds and German wire-haired pointers, the German version of this, which is the Drahthaar. But so many of them, since they've been bred primarily for bird hunting, they'll be high-headed and birdie. Great for wind setting, but they won't get their nose down to work all cold lines. Some do. And I've seen this dogs that were great bird finders, wind setting 50, 60 yards, and could work a cold 24-hour line at the same time. But that's not always the case.
What do you think about all this, Dan?
As far as the dogs are concerned, my question is going back to the actual tracking itself, and I hate to go off topic here, but you mentioned something about bumping a deer. You don't. Sometimes it's going to be hard. You really don't. You can't tell if a deer is dead or not unless you're looking at it. So, if somebody does bump a deer, is there I mean, is it a lost cause that that deer's gone forever, or is there still a chance that you can recover it from where you bumped it?
Yeah, usually if you get really close to the bedded wounded deer before he jumps up and takes off, he is not going to go very far before he beds again. And, you may be able to get it. I found usually if you get close to a deer, you jump him once, he goes out 200 yards, he beds again, and then the second time you jump him, he goes 100 yards, and then he's finished. That's a scenario, and it depends on the cover that you're working in, how much blood the deer leaves going out of the bed, and how far ahead you can see him go. But when a deer takes off, really when he's not even in sight, and you just find it's a bed with a little bit of blood in it, that's not a very good opportunity to catch up to that deer without a tracking dog.
So in that case, when you do bump that deer, going back to the wait or don't wait, regardless of how long you waited in the front end, now you've bumped a deer. I think most of us usually, when we bump a deer, we think, oh, shoot, we just bumped that deer, we better wait. And then we go home or we go back to the truck and wait a couple hours and then try again. I feel like that's the most common response. But in that situation, you bump the deer, are you going to keep pushing it usually, or how do you think about that circumstance?
Well, by the time you've gotten to the point where you've bumped the deer, you probably know how it's wounded. And if it's wounded in the guts, or it's given evidence of being very weak, follow it up. Otherwise, back off. You've always got to think of this problem of the coyotes. It's never simple. It'd be nice if you could write a little manual for hunters in 5 pages of how to find a wounded deer. But, and I've learned, my dogs have taught me that it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I wish it was that easy, that it could be summed up.
That's what I try to deal with in my book, Dead On. That's written for hunters who don't have access to a dog. What can they do to handle and track a deer hit in different places?
So is there anything we haven't touched on that specific topic, the if I don't have a dog? Is there any other big lessons that you've learned that we haven't covered?
Well, we just talked about bow hunting. Is that your...
that's a great point.
The focus, or do you want to expand it to gun hunting?
No, we definitely do want to talk about the firearm side, too. How does that change things?
Okay. Well, I think there's one important thing that we haven't mentioned, and I see this is a hunter mistake that's made time and time again when we get calls on it. On a high back shot with a shotgun slug or a rifle bullet, if the deer goes down immediately and stays down, well, you're going to get that deer. But quite often, that bullet it's hit one of the prongs, spinous processes coming up off the vertebrae, or there's been a shock to the spinal cord within the backbone. The deer goes down, and if it gets up again and takes off, it's gone. We can't catch up with them with a tracking dog. And so many times, hunters, they're so sure that deer was fatally wounded because it went down instantly. Well, if it stays down, that's the case. But if it gets up again, it's gone. And, I've had hunters say, well, I hit him good out at 200 yards, and he went right down. I knew I had him, so I went up to the house to get my ATV and have a cup of coffee. And then when I went down there, he wasn't there anymore. Come find him. And, I've learned not to take those calls because it just, it doesn't work. If the deer shows any signs of getting ready to get up again, you put another shot in him. I think that's the most common error I see gun hunters make.
All right, now before we move on to my next question for John, we need to pause briefly for a word from the sponsors of this episode of the podcast, Carbon Express Arrows. And when it comes to hunting arrows, I think one of the greatest challenges that the average bow hunter has is trying to wade through all the different options available and figure out exactly what kind of arrow and setup is best for his or her hunting application. So with us today is Carbon Express's Alex Tate to help us understand exactly how to pick the right arrow for your situation.
So the two main groups of hunters, and if you don't agree with this, then let me know, but in our heads here, going to be whitetail specifically, that's number one in anywhere. And then two is going to be out west elk hunting or out west mule deer hunting, and that's all kind of the same. A little bit bigger size animals, a little bit longer yardages, a lot less woods. So the differences between those two and the difference between your arrow selection, for a whitetail hunt, I would always recommend a heavy arrow, specifically because in most whitetail situations and habitats, you're going to get a 30-yard shot or less. So speed really does not matter. On top of that, today's bows are so efficient that you really want weight these days, and in my opinion and in a lot of people's opinions, especially at this company. So that would be where I'd push people for whitetails. So like our reds, our mayhem, stuff like that. That's very, very heavy pile drivers for the people who aren't ever going to see over a 30-yard shot. A pile driver is just a phenomenal arrow because it's extremely heavy and you don't need anything else. You're shooting 30 yards max and you're wanting to punch through that animal as fast and efficiently as possible. But when you go out west, you're dealing with 70-yard shots. You're dealing with no trees, and with no trees comes a lot of wind. So you have to start factoring in that as well, and with that becomes you're going to be looking for like a smaller diameter. So like our pile driver pass-through extreme is a great option, 203 inner diameter, extremely heavy, so it helps cut through that wind. A light arrow that is small diameter will only do so much for you because it's still light. It's going to drift. So those would be my two main differences between those, and then also going out west on those longer shots, the more FOC you can get, the better. So a weight forward arrow or a triple spined arrow with 125 grains up front can really pay dividends when you start getting past 40, 50 yards.
So there you go. And if you'd like to learn more about any of the arrows that Alex mentioned, you can visit carbonexpressarrows.com. And now, back to the show. Are there any other differences from the other tracking kind of best practices we talked about, or the times to wait, that we talked about when it came to bow hunting? Is there any other differences when it comes to using a firearm? Do you wait less or longer after a gunshot at all?
I don't think there are any clear differences. The wound that's made is different. An arrow cuts in a specific area. If it hits a vein or whatever, the results are going to occur right away. With a rifle bullet, you have shock around the passage of the bullet. You have tissue damage around the passage of the bullet. And you're dealing with a damage zone that's actually broader than when you shoot with a broadhead. Another thing I'll throw in here, you may want to edit this out, is we get a lot of calls from people that are using mechanical broadheads. And I know when a mechanical broadhead works, it's awesome. But there are so many cases where they give inadequate penetration. Maybe they hit a rib. I think a lot of times hunters will be shooting with a mechanical, I won't mention brand names, but they're tempted to use a light arrow and a light poundage bow. And they get, when they're shooting targets, they get beautiful flat trajectories, but they don't have enough energy in that arrow when it strikes a deer to get all the way through. And sometimes you don't get any exit wound, but you still got a killing wound. But a lot of times, it's 4 inches penetration almost anybody that tracks a lot says, I would never use a mechanical. But, you know, the general hunting public doesn't see it the same way. You know, we just see all the cases where the mechanical doesn't work.
No, that's good
Now,
to know.
When you say doesn't work, I'm a kind of a gear nut. What do you mean by doesn't work? You mean it's not opening like it's supposed to open, or the broadhead itself is damaged and it's not living up to its potential?
It loses its energy, its kinetic energy.
Right.
You know, there's more resistance when those blades open, particularly if they hit a rib or something like that. And so you don't get the penetration. Then when the arrow stops, the blades float. They don't keep on cutting as they would in a standard broadhead, where, you know, with the muscle movement of the animal, it would continue cutting back and forth. So I think this is it, inadequate penetration. I don't see too many cases where they don't open, but I think if you're going to use a mechanical, you want to use a high poundage bow and heavier arrows, you know, not what you would use in a tournament. That brings up another thing too. I think the 3D tournaments show the lethal kill zone, the deer target, in a much too optimistic way. You know, they make it look like if you hit the deer 4 inches below the top line, that's going to kill them good. And the real kill zone for a deer, you know, heart and lungs, is going to be lower than anything you'll see with the current 3D tournament targets. I think that, you know, I'm all for cultivating the art of shooting accurately, but I think in this respect, the competition leads to an unrealistic viewpoint of what the kill zone is in a real live deer.
That's good to know. So it sounds like it's better to err a little bit low than a little bit high, typically. Also,
yeah, I think so. Yeah. And this is especially true with black bear. Now this year in the Northeast, we've got a heavy black bear kill. And most of the time, well, the hunters, you know, they'll shoot through the middle of the chest, and they're a little bit high, and they're just going through muscle. They're not getting into the very low heart-lung area of a black bear.
Interesting. I don't know, Dan. Do you have any other questions on this topic?
No, not really. I think he's provided us with a lot of information today.
Yeah, this has been interesting, especially some of the insights, you know, that go counter to some of the generally held knowledge that's kind of anecdotally been passed down for decades.
Yep.
That's particularly interesting. I think, you know, big take home message for me is to not be afraid to go after these deer that we know for sure have been hit well. I think that makes sense to go after them, but then also to kind of not be afraid to hold off when it's a little bit questionable in the right situations. Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts you'd want to leave, or any other big mistakes, John, that you think that most people are making in the situation that we still need to cover?
Well, I think that a lot of hunters still haven't adjusted to this new age of the coyotes. And what was good advice for Grandpa is not good advice anymore. So that's one thing. I think for the whole wounded deer question, you can't make just a big generalization about the whole thing. You got to break it down into the various situations depending on the anatomy of the deer. And it pays to look at a diagram of deer anatomy so that you can recognize situations when they arise.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess speaking of that then, What resources would you recommend to better understand this type of scenario? And I'd love to hear about your books or any other places people can go online to learn more about your resources or anything else you recommend.
Well, I think my book for hunters that aren't working with dogs, Dead On, is probably the most up to date, because the other writers have not had this experience of working with dogs that tell us what deer actually do. So that book, Dead On, which we sell off our website, borntotrack.com, is, I think, useful. There's a lot of detail. It's a shorter book, I think it's 90 pages, but I want to see this knowledge that the dogs have given us more widespread, and I'm sure other people are going to pick it up and develop it. But right now, I don't think that there's enough that's been published, or videos that have been published. There's a lot to be done here, and it'll be other people who do it. I'm 81, so my tracking days in the woods ended when I was 80. But I want other people to pick this up and to write more. And what you're doing on this program here of publicizing this new knowledge, I think, is tremendously valuable.
Well, hey, we appreciate you sharing that expertise and experience, John. And that website, I believe you said, was borntotrack.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, with there are hyphens between born and born hyphen TO hyphen TRACK.com, and you see that. You can see reviews about it. The tracking dog book has sold actually more than Dead On, but I think that Dead On has a lot of potential for people who don't want to get involved in tracking dogs, and that's not for everybody. Tracking dogs are good for the person who's got the right time and temperament for doing it, but that's not going to appeal to everybody. Yeah. And there's no point in having a tracking dog if he's not well trained and experienced. You just can't take your TV watching pooch off a couch and think you're going to do very much with him.
Yeah, I wish it was that easy. Well, John, we'll make sure to link to that website, so if anybody is interested in reading either one of those books or checking out anything else about what John has been doing, we'll make sure to have a link to that.
And my number is in there, and I like to talk to people about questions they may have, or give them more advice.
Excellent.
I spend my other life as a teacher, so that's communicating information is something I really like to do.
Well, I definitely think you've done that today, John. You helped a lot of people out, us included, so thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Okay.